Hello, everyone. My name is Vo, and I'm a student at the School of Education. I'm joined by my co-organizer, Miguel, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, I am Miguel. I'm actually from the School of Public Health, and I'm currently in Manila, Philippines.
Thank you, Miguel. So it's a bright and early morning here in South Korea, but I would also like to acknowledge that people are joining us from around various places in their afternoons and evenings. We're glad to have you join us in the first spring event of the Let's Talk conference at Hugsy, which explores topics on mental health and cultural identity in Asian and Asian American communities. So I would first like to go over the agenda for today. We'll be starting with some acknowledgements, followed by Professor Yasui's presentation. We'll have a short moderated discussion, a Q&A, and some closing remarks. So for those of you who might be new to using the Q&A features on Zoom, here are some handy instructions to guide you. So first, use the Q&A box to send your questions. Depending on which version you may have, the Q&A box could be at the top of the screen or at the bottom of the screen. Number two, vote for the questions that you find most compelling. So as the questions get submitted, you'll be able to see the questions that people have posted, and you'll be able to vote on the ones that you find interesting. And that way it can help us figure out what to answer. And number three, feel free to use the chat to foster discussion as well. So the takeaway here is that just because a Q&A is towards the latter half of this session doesn't mean that you can't already start engaging with the material and with one another. So I would like to take a moment to recognize these individuals who have made this event and other events in the Let's Talk series become a reality. So Dr. Josephine Kim, who is the director of this conference, has devoted so much of her time and efforts into carving out these kinds of spaces for Asian and Asian American students at Harvard, and for that we're deeply grateful. I'd also like to thank Jenny, Julia, and Juna, who have also helped to create flyers and advertise this event across our social media platforms. So even though you might only see a few people on this webinar, there's a lot of behind the scenes work that went into making this event a possibility. So thank you so much to you all. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Yasui, who's an associate professor at UChicago's Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, formerly known as the School of Social Service Administration a couple of weeks ago. As a clinical psychologist, Professor Yasui was shaped by her multicultural upbringing in various countries such as the UK and Singapore. And an enduring theme of her research is the importance of integrating culture when serving ethnic minority and immigrant populations. Considering how clinicians often adhere to Western understanding of mental health problems, her work is especially significant in a time when the mental health of Asian Americans nationwide has been affected by the resulting racism and widened inequalities of the COVID-19 pandemic. And without further ado, I'll turn the spotlight to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Ru and Miguel, for the introduction. Very nice to meet you. My name is Miwa Yasui, and I'll be talking about some of my work, but also about Asian American mental health in general as well today. So thank you all for participating, and I hope to have an interesting dialogue with all of you. So today I would like to talk about what does it mean to understand mental health, particularly from a cultural framework, and particularly in context of mental health among Asian American families. And I wanted to start off acknowledging that, particularly right now with the pandemic, I will touch a little bit on this in my talk as well, but with the pandemic, many of us have gone through quite a difficult time. There's different burdens that we each may have, which may include isolation. It may include also increased loads in terms of family responsibility or economic financial difficulties. And in the midst of all of this, we are all struggling in some way or other with our mental health. And I think this is something that has impacted many people, actually worldwide. And particularly today, I will talk about the impact on mental health in general among Asian Americans, what the literature has kind of talked about, but also I will integrate some of my recent work that has really started to look at the impact of COVID-19 on mental health as well. So just to start off, this was a few years ago, an article that was in the Atlantic, and it focused on some of the suicides that happened in Silicon Valley, where the suicide rate among adolescents soared 5 times the national average a few years back. And what they found was over a course of 9 months, at least 6 teenagers committed suicide, and between 2010 and 14, an average of 20 children and young adults were killed themselves annually in Santa Clara County, where Palo Alto is located. And one of the things that really highlighted, I think, was the fact that mental health was something that really affected Asian American populations. Oftentimes, because of the model minority myth, Asian American, both youth and young adults, are considered to be successful. They are academically successful and in general appear on the outside to be well-adjusted. Yet this article, I think, was one of the instances by which one can see that actually mental health was affecting the Asian American population. And statistics have indicated the fact that, particularly among Asian American adolescents, that suicide is a main concern. Suicide really is the second leading cause of death for Asian American women, ages 15 to 24. And they have the highest rates of suicide among all racial groups. And studies have shown that also Asian American college students were more likely than white American students to have suicidal thoughts and to attempt suicide, as well as have greater rates of depression. And so we see this alarming trend. I'm talking right now just in regards to suicide, but also when we think about mental health in general, one of the things, because of the model minority myth, has been where mental health has been really overlooked among Asian Americans. And in fact, the rates are actually quite concerning, actually, when you look at this graph. So here we see the percentage of high school students seriously considering suicide. And here we see, again, between Asian American and non-Hispanic white, quite a difference. And this is, you see it across both genders as well. Now, in terms of general mental health, this is actually a slide from SAMHSA, but I think it really captures the state of mental health among Asian Americans. And the prevalence of mental health is really of concern, even in recent years. So among Asian Americans, about 15% indicate that they have mental illness. This was in a survey in the past that was done by SAMHSA. And in the last 12 months, they had reported having some sort of mental illness. And actually data says between 2008 and 2018 that serious mental illness is a concern. It actually rose from 2.9% to 5.6% among AAPI people ages between 18 to 25. So you can see even among serious mental illness, the rates were increasing. And among the same population, between 2015 to 2018, major depressive episodes increased from 10% to 13.6%. And so we see this rise in mental health problems that are increasing over the past years. We have also talked of suicide rates. And again, we have found the same trend, that there has been actually increase in terms of AAPI youth and young adults reporting serious thoughts of suicide. And that has increased from 2008 to 2018 in a similar trend. And so what we're seeing is that actually mental health is something that has been of increasing concern in the last year. And this is even pre-pandemic data. And so if you think about currently, as we are going through the effects of COVID-19, the impact on mental health, particularly among Asian Americans, is of significant concern. Now, going to COVID-19 and its impact on mental health, this is just data that is pulled from a general population. So this is one of many studies that have been recently published. This is a study by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And in their poll, they actually found that the percentage of, this is a data that shows the percentage of adults who say they worry or have stress related to COVID and how that impacts their mental health. And this is in relation to their stay-at-home orders. And here we see that 47% of those sheltering in place reported negative mental health effects resulting from worry or stress related to coronavirus. And this is significantly higher than the 37% among people who are not sheltering in place. So you can see that even the impact of COVID-19, how we are maintaining social distancing, that has had an additional effect in terms of mental health nationwide. And among Asian Americans, what has actually increased mental health effects of this pandemic has been the increased rates of racism that has been found among Asian Americans since the onset of COVID-19. In a national online study, they found that among US residents, there was more than 40% of Americans who reported that they had engaged in at least one discriminatory behavior towards people of Asian descent. So you can see that even among the general population, discrimination, racism against Asian Americans actually was something that was reported as having increased, that they were engaging in this. And in June of last year, the Pew Research Center, in their survey, they actually found that 31% of Asian Americans had been subject to slurs or jokes because of their race or ethnicity, compared to 21% for Blacks, 15% for Hispanics, and 8% for whites. And so you can see that particularly with the impact of COVID-19, how the Asian Americans have been portrayed in the media, how that has been really broadcasted in the public sphere, that has really impacted the mental health of Asian Americans generally. And I think that actually has been also found worldwide as well. And so in this way, it is quite concerning to see the effects, the increased effects. And I think in this current context, when we think about the lack of attention to Asian American mental health, and yet the impact it really actually has on this population, it really is something that clinicians and also I think public health officials need to keep in mind, that Asian American communities also are important communities of color that really need to be included in terms of understanding how to maintain better mental health. And in studies, what they have found that actually the pandemic effects, they found that actually the discrimination that Asian Americans have experienced actually have been associated with the mental health gaps between Asians and also whites. And so as you can see, again, the impact of racism has had an additional impact on the mental health of Asian Americans. So given this, now we know that there is a mental health need, and that particularly when we think about right now during the pandemic, there is a lot of need in terms of seeking mental health. One of the things that we would often come to mind is the fact that mental health, if we're struggling with mental health, are they seeking mental health services? And actually this is pre-COVID data, but one of the things that studies again and again have found is that among all races and ethnicities, Asian American populations actually seek mental health services the least. And this pattern has been found across many research studies. What is utmost also within Asian Americans, it is actually Asian American males who seek services the least. And so here we see a population where there is significant mental health need, and yet they are not seeking mental health services. So this gap, I think, is something that clinicians, and particularly I think those who are stakeholders in Asian American communities have noticed and have increasingly have voiced their concerns in terms of the need to try to have mental health services more accessible and also reach Asian American communities. So one might ask, well, why is there this underutilization? And studies have shown that Asian Americans are less likely to access mental health services. Studies also have found that they're actually more likely to delay treatment, seeking treatment. Oftentimes that they would engage in different kinds of self-care, also help-seeking behavior. And it is only when it comes to the last step that they actually are seeking treatment. Studies also have found that actually when Asian American clients are engaged in treatment, that they are actually not as connected with the clinician. They're less engaged and thus more likely to drop out. And so this is something, again, that is important to note, that number one, there is mental health need, and yet access is low. And even when Asian Americans actually access mental health services, the engagement is also of concern. So we can see this problem that really is crucial within the Asian American community. Now, within my work, one of the things that I have actually looked at to try to understand this gap, this very gap of there is a mental health need, there are services that are available, but how is it that Asian Americans are not utilizing mental health services? And my work centers on the area of culture and trying to understand how culture, through the cultural lens, to understand how mental health is understood, how it's experienced, and how it can manifest. And so the way that the framework that I use is that culture really shapes the very meaning of what we think about health and also the approaches to health. So at the individual level for each and every one of us, we may have particular beliefs, certain attitudes regarding what might be healthy practices. And this will be in regards to our mental health as well. We may have this differently for how we think about our physical health versus our mental health, but we all engage in different ways of thinking about what it means to have distress. And now when you think about beyond how you think about your family. How do your parents think about mental health? Do they think about it in the same way that you do? How about your siblings or your grandparents or relatives? Family members also have various expectations, beliefs about mental health. They may engage in different ways of coping and dealing with distress. That may or may not be the same as you yourself. And then going broader to the community level, when we think about the communities that we're embedded in, the ethnic communities we're in, the peer communities, the spiritual religious communities we may be in, the affinity groups that we're in, these communities also have various beliefs about mental health, the ways that they think about distress, certain norms that they might practice, and also what are the values regarding mental health that may be common among the people in the particular community that you're in. And then going beyond that, when we think about kind of the cultural levels, your own, what does it mean when for us as Asian Americans, it could be what does it mean that my Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Vietnamese culture, Korean culture, how do they think about mental health? What are the beliefs? What are the norms and practices? And then within that, we also want to consider the broader mainstream American beliefs and norms. And so there's so many levels by which the understanding of mental health is really impacted. And for each and every one of us, it's going to be an intersection of all of these. And it won't be always a cookie cutter approach, that an individual's way of thinking about mental health is going to be influenced in different ways, by which, particularly when we think about a person coming to a clinic, it's critical that the clinician really understands this complexity of how they think about mental health. So one of the frameworks that I have come up with in my work is trying to understand what are the ways in which mental health is understood. And I will actually walk through this model. I won't talk about it because I can spend a whole hour probably going over it in detail, but I will talk about sections of it. So I'll be talking about sections, first of all, in regards to what's called the conceptualization of distress. And one of the things is that the ways in which we think about the distress we have, how we talk about it, what we think are the causes of it, what we name it, that is something that is going to be crucial in determining the ways in which we actually experience that mental distress. And that goes to the second part of the meaning of the illness to self. What are the ways in which that the illness experience of handling mental distress, what does it say about me in terms of who I am? Here are the internal characteristics. What does it mean in terms of the outcome that I believe that I have? Will I have a life that is normal, or would I think that it is something that will be devastating, that it will never become better? It would also affect the ways in which I think about the agency or the self-efficacy I have in terms of what it means to have mental distress. And then in a large part, particularly I think for Asian American communities, is the impact of norms. And again, going back to the fact that we're embedded, we are not just individuals, but we're embedded in families and in communities, in cultural groups, affinity groups. And the ways in which they think about mental health, the ways in which they think about coping, that also affects the the lived experience that we have in terms of distress. And so that then leads to how we think about seeking help, and also thinking about whether or not mental health services are an actual route for treatment. So going on this, I'm breaking down kind of this conceptual framework. In particular with Asian American populations, the conceptualization of mental health has tended to be one where mental illness and mental health problems has been associated with more severity. And oftentimes this is across my own studies, but also studies that many studies that have been published, that mental health problems or having mental health has been associated with either being crazy or defective or having severe dysfunction. And so you can see that from the conception of how one thinks about mental health, there is this stigmatizing component that can be very difficult for one who is experiencing that. Also, studies have also shown, and even within my own work, I have found that mental health problems have been considered as countercultural. Participants in my own study have talked about mental health as something that white people have. It's not really something that Asians will deal with, or we might have too many problems. We may be more busy trying to make sure that we're putting food on the table, or making sure that we're pursuing careers or academic paths, and that would be more important than thinking about emotional health. And so the emphasis on emotions, thinking about mental health, and sometimes has been viewed as countercultural. So again, you can see this way in which the conceptualization of mental health has been kind of steered towards more the stigmatized, where mental health is associated with severity. In addition, mental health distress has been associated with emotional weakness. And in some of the Asian American cultures, and I wouldn't say all, because again, I really want to acknowledge when we say Asian Americans, it is a very, very diverse group. It is more diverse than many other racial groups, in that there's more than 20 different countries of origin. If you think about the range of languages, cultural values, belief systems, even religion, there's so much diversity within Asian Americans. And so again, I do want to just note that what I am sharing is not applicable to all. It's something that I don't want for people to think that it will be generalized. However, among some Asian cultures where Confucian concepts have been shared, the notion of expressing your distress, just expressing your emotion, has been associated with weakness. And so in those ways, when one is sharing emotional distress, that may be then associated with a character weakness, that you have weak will, or that you are someone who is weak. And so this conceptualization of mental health as something that is negative is something that really can shape the ways in which one then starts to think about one's lived experience. In addition to this conceptualization, the ways in which we even experience mental health is going to shape the ways in which what we think about what mental health is. If you think about it, right now, if we think about the US healthcare system, and I think this has become more widespread now, when we think about wellness and health, we go to a primary care physician for our physical health problems. We go to a mental health professional for our mental health problems. In this way, there's kind of a dichotomy of how we think about wellness. And yet, quite interestingly, what is actually more common universally is that wellness and health is more comprehensive worldwide. The integration of the body, mind, and spirit, that is something that is more shared across cultures. And so when we think about kind of this integration of self in terms of wellness as something that really integrates not the mind, body, and spirit, that is something that is in some ways contrary to the ways in which our current healthcare system is set up. Even my own training as a clinical psychologist has been really focused on this element of mental health. And through my work, I'm learning to come back to understanding what does it mean to be well as a human being in terms of a wholeness, of integrating all of these. And so even in terms of the conceptualization, Asian Americans the studies have found that Asian Americans often would experience mental distress in the form of what we call somaticization. So it would be in the form of, let's say, it could be a stomach problem or a headache or having neck pain or shoulder pain. And in this way, sometimes the first route is to figure out what might be the problem with my body, but realizing that the cause is not related to actual physical issues, but it's actually related to mental health, and mental distress. And so in this way, the conceptualization of mental health is something that is really important to understand. In addition, when we think about the causes, when we sometimes, in some cultures, be that the ways in which they think mental health and mental distress is how it's manifested, maybe because it could be related to what may be a biological or genetic problem. In some cultures where there might be religion and spirituality as a main focus, they may attribute it to more spiritual issues or even supernatural problems. And in this way, there's so much variety in terms of how one might attribute a cause that not go along with the current kind of perception of mental health as really integrated within one's biology and also in one's psychology, that the cause can be seen as something that is outside. And so that's something, again, that is really important to understand when we think about the conceptualization. When we have these conceptualizations of mental health, and as I kind of noted, particularly within the Asian American community, the increased stigma that has been noted among Asian Americans regarding mental health, the responses have been denial or dismissing this. And even in the area of mental distress, again, expressing mental distress is something that is more considered countercultural. And hence, oftentimes there's a silencing of one's own emotions, one's difficulties, and one might talk about what is more positive, or might focus on conversations that may be things that are good, or it may be focused on things that are physical problems, but not problems related to one's mental health. And so there is a dismissing of mental illness, also discussions regarding mental distress that happens. And in addition, that then relates to discriminatory behaviors towards individuals with mental illness. And in this way, studies have found that, particularly in some communities where there is a lot of mental health stigma, there's limiting or restricting of responsibilities of individuals with mental illness, social exclusion and avoidance, and unfair treatment. And again, one thing I do want to note is that stigma of mental health is something that is not specific to Asian American communities. It is something that is universal. However, the ways in which it manifests within our homes, within individuals and the communities is culturally unique. In my own work, what I have found that actually the young adult may notice that they have what they might characterize their distress as, let's say, depression or anxiety. So they might conceptualize their problem as depression. However, within their family, because depression might be considered as stigmatizing, or it might be something that is a concept that is dismissed, the young person then struggles to share their distress with their family members. They fear that they would be judged, or they would just be dismissed, or their emotions minimized. And this is something that I have found in my own work, that oftentimes has been the interaction between family members. And again, when we think about why this happens, is because when we think about Asian American families, it is not just one, even within one ethnic group, we have so much variation. In an Asian American family, think of the generational differences. Parents who may be the first generation immigrants will have a conceptualization that is embedded from their culture of origin. And that is going to look different than the young person who may be American born, who grew up with an understanding of mental health that is rooted in, let's say, school systems here in the US, that they have integrated notions and conceptualizations of mental health from the general society. And so you can see how even within one's household, the understanding of mental health is going to be very varied due to the cultural conceptions of mental health. And so in this way, the stigma that one may experience may be something that is not even really cognizant. And so the parents may not really realize that the ways in which they might be responding to their child is stigmatizing. They might think it might be more normative because that's how they grew up, or that's how they dealt with their emotional distress. And yet for the person who is experiencing it, it could be really experienced as rejection, as being stigmatized. And so even within families, we have this very complex issue where mental health stigma starts to hold root within families. And here we can see that it actually then can go broader into the community. When we think about the community we live in, I'll take an example with the ethnic community. We'll have generations and generational differences among people who are elders, parents' generations, and young people. And if we think about, again, the cultural conceptualizations of mental health, they're going to look very different. And the ways in which they might think are the ways to cope would be very different as well. And so in this way, the attitudes and responses to mental health is so complex that it's not easy to say, oh, let's say Chinese Americans think about mental health this way, or Korean Americans think about it that way. It really requires dissecting and thinking about intersectionality at the family level and even at the individual level, because the young person is also has dual perspectives within them as they are thinking about the ways in which they think about mental health. They are also understanding mental health from their culture, their parents' cultural perspective. And it's those, and the clashing of that can sometimes be a very difficult problem in the lived experience of Asian American young adults. This then also will affect the ways in which they think about mental health services. And so as I kind of started in the beginning in kind of sharing some data with you that has been widely kind of shared across nationally as well, when we think about this gap in terms of why Asian Americans are not utilizing mental health services, we can see that how mental health stigma really can play a role in preventing people from seeking mental health services. And what I found interesting in my work is that even though Asian American young adults recognize what they had was depression or anxiety, and they recognize that mental health services would be very helpful, what prevented them from actually seeking mental health services was sometimes the fear of bringing stigma and also bringing down their family's reputation. And so that prevented them from seeking mental health services. And they were very afraid of finding care with the fear that that information would be shared with others, that it will go out, and then it would not just be their own reputation, but it would be the reputation of their family members. And so in this way, mental health stigma has been something that has been found to really impact the engagement in treatment for Asian Americans. And again, the other thing that I had noted in terms of conceptualization, the ways in which we think about distress. If we experience distress as physical, we may not consider it as something that is mental distress. In some cultures, if spirituality is really important, they might consider it as a spiritual problem, not a mental health problem. So again, that conceptualization will determine whether or not one thinks mental health services is an appropriate way to find help. And then the other literature that has been noted was beliefs about professionals. And studies have noted this is not just specific to Asian Americans, but also ethnic minority populations, that oftentimes when Asian American clients or ethnic minority clients have actually sought services, most likely, oftentimes, the provider will not be sharing the same ethnic or racial background. They might not even share the same social and economic background as well. And so there's already a cultural gap when we think about the relationship between the client and the clinician. And here, particularly for those who are Asian American, the lack of understanding of professionals, of their cultural values, the ways in which their family thinks about them, the norms of their culture in regards to how, let's say, children should behave or what might be normative parental expectations. When that is dismissed in the clinical context, that can also enlist a doubt. Does this person understand me? Will they really try to understand me for who I am and from someone from my own background? And so that's something that has been also widely studied in terms of this misfit between clinicians and also clients. And so again, when we think about the mental health stigma within Asian American communities, one of the things that I would say, particularly on the end of someone like myself who is a clinical psychologist and also who teaches social work students, is that the number of Asian American students who are seeking professions regarding mental health is also very limited. So not only do we have this gap in terms of understanding, but we even have this gap in terms of the actual number of people who are seeking these professions, who would actually be able to be the people who share the ethnic and cultural context with these very clients that we are meeting. And then also beliefs about medication. There are ethnic group differences. In some cultures, Western medication, so the use of psychiatric medication may be considered as not, as poison, even some may consider it as even like poisoning the body. And so, for example, within Chinese traditional medicine, the idea is to really kind of heal your body within using your own body energy, and bringing something that is foreign into your body will be considered as unhealthy. That may not be the appropriate thing to do. So again, we want to think about how do beliefs about medication in regards to mental illness, mental distress, how is that also conceptualized among Asian Americans? And when we think about all of these things, it really then brings to light the difficulty that we have in trying to serve Asian American communities because of all these different aspects, conceptualization, but also the very lived experience that they may fear being stigmatized, the complexity of having others understand them in terms of mental distress, whether it be family members or community members, and then also in terms of how they think about the care that they will receive. So what would we do with this? I would say I don't have the golden answer or the one answer to give, but I think there are several clinical considerations that we can have. I think that, as I have noted, it's integral to think about what might be culturally anchored conceptualizations of mental health and really integrate these into our clinical assessments. So from the beginning, oftentimes a client might come into a therapeutic context, and the ways in which assessment occurs is oftentimes assessment of what might be clinical symptoms. And yet what is often missing is how is distress understood from a cultural standpoint. And so integrating assessments that really think about the culture, the background of the person will be really important in integrating into conducting more culturally responsive treatments. The other part is the adaptation of mental health treatments based on client understandings of mental health. And I think there are many researchers that have actually started this and pioneering this within the Asian American community. Studies where they have actually really created from the ground up culturally really responsive treatments that integrate elements of, let's say, mindfulness or Buddhist beliefs into treatments, and bringing that into the actual integrating that with evidence-based treatments. And so adapting current mental health treatments that really speak to the beliefs and values and practices of Asian Americans is also a critical way to really address this gap in terms of engagement in treatment. And then lastly is the enhancing training of cultural competence among mental health service providers. I think this is an ongoing process. It is something that continues to be improved. And the reality is no clinician will be culturally competent. And yet that's something that for all clinicians, trainees, and particularly those who are in standing in the place where they're training clinicians, it's really critical to continue to advance oneself, to think about what are the ways in which can we integrate the cultural perspective, understand the context, think about the intersectionality of clients and communities, and bring that into treatment and thinking about training of future providers. And finally, I would say that one of the things that will be really important, particularly for communities, is increasing mental health awareness and then knowledge. I think this is something that is happening, I think, on a large scale, but it's critical to have more educational programs regarding mental health. But also, this has to be done in a way that speaks the language of the people in the communities. And so anti-stigma campaigns can be helpful, but also it has to be culturally responsive, that it has to speak the language of the people who are there. And so I think these are the ways in which mental health, the mental health gap can really be addressed. Finally, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share. And I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much for that high-level overview, Professor Yasui. I personally learned a lot from your presentation, and it also spoke personally to my own experiences as a Korean person who grew up in the diaspora. So I would like to leave enough time for the Q&A, but if I could, I would like to ask one question regarding your content. So for Asian American youths who struggle to speak to their parents about mental health problems, what are some ways they can view culture as a bridge rather than a barrier towards understanding and healing? I think about the ways that even today there's so many issues in terms of like speaking to one's parents about mental health problems to the point that it is mimified across the internet. But it seems like one of the implications of your culture-infused engagement model is that it's not ignoring culture, but rather actually using culture as a standpoint from which we can have these conversations. So I was wondering if you could speak more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I think I might not be able to give the one answer. I think culture actually, as you've said, I really loved how you framed it. How can you use it as a bridge? In my work, what I have found is that the ways in which the young people have thought about the reason why their parents may not respond in the way that they desire is because of a cultural gap. And so they've seen it more as culture, as kind of the element that really separates them. One of the things I have found through my work is that it is actually where the young adult, and I've been just really impressed with the ways in which Asian American young adults have developed ways of resilience in the context of not being able to be understood. They themselves have actually stepped forward to try to understand the cultural perspective of their parents. So in this sense, what they have actually done is a cultural brokering. They have bridged from being, as an American born, trying to understand their parents' perspective, trying to understand why is it that my father or my mother doesn't see my emotional distress. And what I have found through the many participants, and it's been such a privilege to really learn through them, is that they try to construct the understanding of mental health by understanding their parents' own experiences of distress. That, for example, some of the participants who in my study are Cambodian American, and they have noted that for their parents who've gone through the Khmer Rouge, they would not have any opportunities to speak about their emotional distress, because that would be something that would not be allowed. And so when they think about how their parents grew up, the experiences that they've gone through, they try to reconcile and they've tried to understand that is the reason why the parents cannot understand the ways in which distress is expressed here for young adults. And so what they have done is actually stepped in their parents' shoes and used their parents' language to try to share their own emotions. And I have found that the family interactions by which the young adult starts to share about their distress, but in the language of their parents, that has led to conversations that has opened eyes for some of the parents. I wouldn't say for all. It's not a magic bullet. The other, I think the other example is when family members have had shared experience of distress. And I think the pandemic actually has been one of the positive things I would say that I have found in my work, looking at the impact of COVID-19, has been that families now understand what it means to have to social distance and kind of live this very virtual life. And that has a mental health toll on not just young adults, but family members as well. And that shared experience has led to talking more about mental distress as a family. And so that has led to kind of a shared experience that they can start from, where the family can start to put together different conceptualizations, but finding a point of connection.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Yasui. We also have a few questions from the audience, which I will be asking. One of the questions has been, I think Asian Americans are looking for therapists that speak their language and know their culture. Are there any studies about Asian Americans using mental health professionals more when there are therapists who speak their language and know their culture?
There are studies that have indicated that ethnic match and also language match can increase the engagement and also treatment outcome. I would say not just for Asian Americans, but also minority populations. However, again, it's not that in itself does not relate to, it doesn't mean that it always relates to someone engaging in treatment and having a better treatment outcome. I've actually found in my own work that it really varies. For some people, having a therapist, a clinician of the same background can be so helpful because they feel understood. They feel that they understand things about their family, some of the difficulties of growing up bicultural. These are things that would be shared. However, on the other hand, through my work, I've also found that there are participants or young adults who feel that it would be better to have a therapist of different ethnic and cultural background because of the fear of stigma. That if they met an Asian American clinician, most likely that person may be related to a person in my community. And the fear of if that information goes out, that would be detrimental to myself and my family. And so then they might prefer to meet with a provider who is kind of outside of their network in order to maintain that confidentiality.
Okay, next question from our audience members is, would you mind sharing some effective ways in addressing the stigmas?
That's a big question. I would say, well, I think everyone knows, I think obviously anti-stigma campaigns can be helpful. I think the actual impact, I think studies that have gone looking at kind of the effect of kind of broad anti-stigma campaigns, they've been done much in Australia and they found some effects of it, but not as strong as we actually hope for. And I think particularly when we think about Asian American communities, is that there's a reason why I think mental health is stigmatized. It's because mental health is equated with severity. And part of it, I think, is the language that we associate with mental health and mental illness. And so if there are ways to talk about distress that are culturally normative, that will then open up conversations to talk about how we feel when we are struggling in a way that is culturally acceptable and allows the community to respond. So I'll give an example. I think Lo would know this, but for example, the culturally bound syndrome of Kwapyon, that is something that is not considered a mental disorder. It's not a mental illness. It's something that is experienced across many women in Korean culture. It's something that is also culturally shared and also sometimes portrayed even in media. And so that sense of when it's an experience that has been shared among people and not coined as something that is mental illness allows that conversation to happen to really start to address. I think a similar way has been in terms of, I think we will call it neurasthenia. So in Chinese culture, there's a way of indicating distress, but it's not related. The diagnosis will not be depression or anxiety. And so there's a culturally normative way of thinking about distress that is acceptable, but is not related to going to a therapist or kind of a psychiatrist. And so finding those ways, I think, would be a way to address stigma at the community level.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one or two more questions. How can we encourage or support Asian males to get mental health care?
Good question. I have to think about this. I think this is something that I've also noticed in my own work. And again, I humbly say I do not have the answer. I would share what I've learned. I think that particularly, I think within cultures where there's gender norms that are embedded in the culture, this can become very difficult. And I think it's something that has been shared even universally, where there is a certain expectations how males should act, how they should express emotion, how they should behave when they are in distress. And oftentimes that is something that really prevents many males to express the very deep feelings that they have. And oftentimes it is silenced and also reinforced in society. And so I would say that particularly for Asian American males, I think one of the things is to be able to communicate in a way that will not will consider the difficulty of what it may appear like to feel weak or appear weak to somebody by sharing their distress. I think it helps to have other male role models who can actually, in some ways, show how you can share your emotions, but in a way that is different from, let's say, how Asian females would, but in a way that is unique to the male experience. And being able to see that, I think, can be very powerful, that whether they see that in the media or whether they see that in their lives as mentors or even professionals, that when there is kind of a exposure of kind of one's vulnerability, that can be then seen as courage instead of vulnerability and weakness. And so having those role models, I think, can be critical, particularly for those who are struggling.
All right, thank you so much. We have time for one more question. So you did mention how in Asian cultures, physical and mental health tends to be integrated. So what would an integration of physical and mental health look like when we, for example, go to a primary care physician?
Well, I'll start off by saying I'm not a primary care physician, so I won't be able to answer what that would look like. What I think this happens in some places where there's integrated care. I think it would be ideal because oftentimes for many Asian Americans who conceptualize or who even experience their distress in a physical form, their go-to would be their physician. And they would try to find out, why is it that I'm having headaches, or I have I'm having stomach aches or shoulder pain, and they would try to find the cause. And if I think primary care physicians are also trained or can actually tag team with mental health professionals in terms of also talking about the effects of mental distress on the physical body, I think that's where a conversation can start to think about the wholeness, the healing of the whole body, right? The whole person. And not just separate out, okay, I'm the primary care physician, so we'll just deal with kind of these physical elements. I'll then send you off to a mental health professional for your mental concerns. I think when there is a place where that integration can happen, then the treatment approach is holistic. It really starts to address the whole person. And so I think bringing together different disciplines and professionals in a setting, I think, can be the most ideal way to address that integration.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Yusui. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for attending our talk. We do have upcoming events for our Let's Talk series. We'll have webinars on South Asia mental health and AAPI youth with disabilities. So please feel free to check talkhgse.org for our upcoming events. We'll also be having a Let's Talk professional conference for educators and clinicians, focusing on promoting the success and well-being of Asian and Asian American students, which will have continuing education credits available. And yeah, thank you so much, Professor Yasui. Would you have any closing words or statements to our audience members?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for this opportunity to share. It's really a privilege to be able to speak to an audience that really cares about mental health, and particularly within the Asian American community. And for me, having both of you just lead this, I think is so powerful that you yourselves are role models. And I think, again, for those who are attending, you can be the people who actually are the pioneers to really bring mental health within your communities, within your families. And I think that my hope is that the conversation doesn't end here, but it will extend into your own spheres, with your peers, with your family members, your communities. You can be the ones who can make that change. And so my hope is that would happen. And I just really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for willing to talk. And is there anywhere our audience members can see you or contact you should they have any conversations or questions?
Sure. They can contact me. I think my faculty website will be available, so they can contact me at my email. It's myasui, which is my last name, at uchicago.edu. If you have questions, please email me. I'll be more than happy to engage in conversation. It really excites me, particularly knowing that there's such a gap, that this young generation is interested in mental health, is invested. And I really believe that the next generation will be those who would change things for the Asian American community. So I look forward to seeing that as someone who is much older.
And that is it for our presentation. We'd like to thank the audience for attending and Professor Yasui for having such an informative talk. Yeah.